Hello, welcome to Love Lust Betrayal. Subscribe if you like our stories. Let's dive into the story. The story began on what appeared to be a typical evening. After dinner, our normal conversations about domestic issues changed to something more acerbic and intense. I asked her a routine question about a bill that needed to be paid, and she gave me an irritated look. Her answer was anything but ordinary. She said, "I'm not your property," in a tone that pierced the atmosphere. Her words lingered in the room like a storm cloud. I wasn't sure how to respond at first. Was it a declaration of independence, a defiant statement, or an accusation? She seemed to be drawing a line in the sand with the way she spoke, the tone she used, and the expression in her eyes, undermining the very basis of what I thought our relationship was based on. I remained silent. How could I respond? I simply nodded, but something changed within. At first, it was something colder, something determined, rather than anger. I silently cleared the table while her words replayed in my head. I reflected on all the sacrifices I had made over the years, working long hours, resolving issues, and making sure her life was going smoothly, and now I was being told that it didn't matter because I was essentially treating her like property. I stayed up, replaying the conversation that night. Was she correct? Had I been domineering? Was this her way of sharing the duties we both agreed upon when we got married? Or had I diminished her role in our relationship to something transactional? She didn't see herself as accountable to me the way I had always seen myself as accountable to her, but I could not figure out what she really meant. A silent resolve grew inside me as I gazed at the ceiling in the darkness. All right, I thought. I wouldn't treat her like my property if she didn't want to be, but she couldn't expect me to take care of her either. It was about justice, not retaliation. I would fully grant her independence if she so desired. She pretended nothing had happened the following morning, but I had already changed. I had made a complete mental change. I made the decision to act subtly, at least initially, no big announcements, no conflicts. When she asked if I would pay a bill that week, I would instead let the circumstances speak for themselves. Calmly, I told her, "You can manage it." She looked at me bewildered but remained silent. Even though it was a little thing, it had symbolic meaning for me. I was no longer going to look after her. I refused to run her life while she brushed off my role as being unimportant or oppressive. I saw more chances throughout the day to let her take charge. She appeared perplexed, perhaps even irritated, but she didn't push back. Not yet. I didn't grab my toolbox when the kitchen faucet began to leak, and I didn't take her car to the station for gas like I usually would. My resolve was strengthened by the declaration she had made the previous evening, which was still vivid in my memory. I was focused, not angry. This had to do with balance, not punishment. She couldn't expect the privileges that came with that kind of relationship if she didn't want to be treated as though she belonged to me. I wouldn't meddle in her affairs, but I also wouldn't support them in the end. She had noticed something was wrong, but she hadn't yet made the connection, and I wasn't going to explain it to her, so I could feel a little tension in the air. She would need to possess it in its entirety if she desired independence. I had a strange feeling of clarity that night as I lay in bed once more. This was a change in my perspective on our relationship and how I would manage it moving forward. It wasn't a game or a passing phase. I was prepared to show her what life without my ownership really looked like, no matter what happened next. I got up early the following morning as usual, but this time I wasn't compelled to get out of bed by the same old sense of duty. The sounds of her morning routine beginning down the hall kept me there for a few more minutes. Today, I stayed put and let her make the coffee instead of me, who usually does it. When I eventually got up, I imagined that she was in the kitchen, holding a mug close to the coffee maker. She had been reminding me about her oil change all week, and I could tell she was expecting me to bring it up, but I didn't. The car keys were beside her. As though it were any other day, I poured myself some coffee and settled in to browse through my phone. "You intend to bring the vehicle in today, correct?" After a few minutes of silence, she inquired. I didn't raise my eyes. No, you're capable of handling it. Halfway to her lips, she froze her mug. What are you saying? That's something you always take care of. I gave a shrug. Not now. It's your vehicle. She narrowed her eyes a little but said nothing else. I heard the faint slam of the car door as she drove away, and she said a sharp, clipped goodbye as she left the house. That was the routine's first minor lapse, but it wasn't the last. I conducted myself with a purposeful distance throughout the day. During her lunch break, she called to remind me of an insurance payment, which I had always taken care of without fail. She said nonchalantly, "Hey, remember that the auto insurance is due tomorrow." I didn't think twice. "The account information is in the folder, so you can pay for it." The pause was brief enough for me to pick up on the other person's perplexity. "Why are you behaving this way?" At last, she inquired. I spoke in a calm tone. "I'm not pretending. I'm simply letting you take care of things. You're more than capable of." She uttered a short, incredulous laugh before the line fell silent once more. All right, whatever." The tension was evident when she got home that night. I purposefully neglected to do a few things, such as taking out the trash, which I always did. As she entered the kitchen, I saw her take a quick look at the overflowing trash can. Her face was etched with frustration, but she remained silent. Dinner was also a low-key affair. She waited for me to explain myself, but I remained silent. Without offering to help her, I prepared food for myself, put the dishes in the sink and returned to my own work. It wasn't retaliation. Rather, it was a subdued illustration of what life was like without the obligations she had grown to expect from me. She finally broke the silence that evening. "Will you explain the situation to me?" Her voice was sharp as she asked. I glanced at her as I reclined in my chair. "I believe you stated that you are not my property." Her face grew stern. "Yes, I did say that." "If you're not my property, then you're also not my responsibility," I said calmly. She opened her mouth as though to argue, but she didn't say anything. She turned and left the room after standing there for a while, staring at me. As I sat there in the quiet aftermath, I heard the bedroom door click shut. I experienced an odd range of feelings. It wasn't simple. I knew it was essential if she wanted independence, but it didn't feel good to watch her struggle with the change in our dynamic. Even if it meant tearing down the foundation we had built together, one tiny bit at a time, I was determined to give it to her. The days that followed were a silent unraveling. I followed through on my strategy, keeping my composure while distancing myself from duties and obligations that I used to perform mindlessly. With each day that went by, the cracks in our routine got wider. When she got home from work one evening, it was the first real break. The trash I had left by the door was still there, and the house was darker than usual. Normally, I would have started dinner, turned on the lights, and taken it out already. Rather, I was in the living room, totally unconcerned, watching a show. She entered, looked around, and let out a loud sigh. "Really, are you just sitting there?" With a hint of frustration in her voice, she inquired. I didn't even raise my eyes. "Yes, it was a long day. You could at least take out the trash." She threw her bag more forcefully than needed onto the counter. I gave a shrug. "You can handle it. It's not that heavy." As though she was having trouble believing what she was hearing, her eyes widened a little. She appeared to argue for a second, but then she snatched up the trash bag and hurried out the door, slamming it behind her. When I awoke the following morning, the sink was overflowing with dishes. I had never witnessed her leave them unwashed before. It was a tiny act of rebellion. Although she wouldn't let me win easily, my goal for the week was to make a point rather than win. The dominoes kept falling, the groceries ran low because I neglected to replenish the pantry. Her laundry remained unwashed in the basket despite my habit of doing it without being asked, minor annoyances mounted, and her annoyance became more apparent every day. The tension reached a boiling point by the middle of the week. I hadn't paid the utility bill when she got home from work. The lights had been turned off earlier that afternoon, so I knew. I had a few minutes to pay it, but I chose not to. I wanted her to experience the repercussions firsthand this time. Anger flushed her face as she bounded into the living room. "There is no power," she yelled. "What prevented you from paying the bill?" Calmly, I looked into her eyes. "You were aware that it was due. The folder contains the account information." Exasperated, she raised her hands. "What are you doing? You're being so Angie, so childish." I stood up slowly, letting her words hang in the air. "Childish, you said. You're not my property. Remember, I'm respecting that, but if you're not my property, then I'm not your caretaker. You want independence. Fine, but independence means taking responsibility for your life." Her expression faltered for a moment as if she wasn't sure how to respond. Then, with a bitter laugh, she shook her head. "This isn't independence. This is just you being petty." I didn't argue. I just let her words hang in the air as I walked past her into the kitchen. I wasn't interested in convincing her. I wanted her to understand that night she ended up on the phone with customer service trying to sort out the power issue. I could hear the frustration in her voice. As she navigated the automated system, something I would have handled with ease before, watching her struggle wasn't satisfying, but it reinforced my decision. If she wanted me to step back, I would do so completely, even if it made life harder for both of us. By the end of the week, the house felt different. It wasn't just the mess piling up or the tasks left undone. It was the silence, the unspoken tension between us. We had slipped into a cold war of sorts, each testing the other's limits. The one seamless rhythm of our relationship had become disjointed. Series of beats and awkward silences, and yet I remained steadfast. If this was the path she wanted, I would follow it to its conclusion no matter where it led. By the end of that week, the tension in the house was suffocating. The power had been restored, the trash finally taken out, and some of the groceries restocked, but not by me. She was doing the bare minimum to keep things functioning, but the weight of our unraveling routine was visible in her every move. The silence between us had turned into a battlefield, each of us waiting for the other to speak first that Saturday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee and scrolling through my phone. She walked in, her hair still messy from sleep, and went straight to the fridge. The empty shelves greeted her, and she slammed the door shut. "This can't keep going," she said, her voice tight. I didn't look up. "What can't?" She spun around to face me. "This, whatever this is, you acting like you're some passive observer in this house. We're supposed to be a team." I put my phone down and leaned back in my "Are we?" because last time I checked you said you're not my property. Teams rely on responsibility, and I don't think I'm part of yours anymore. She crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "Don't twist my words. I didn't mean I wanted you to check out of our life completely." "Well, that's the thing about words," I replied, my tone calm but firm. "Once they're out there, they mean something. You made it clear you don't want to feel like you owe me anything." "Fine, but that goes both ways." Her frustration boiled over. "This isn't about owing anyone anything. It's about respect, about not feeling like my life revolves around your decisions." I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "Respect," I said, my voice finally rising. "Do you think respect is me silently fixing every problem, paying every bill and cleaning up every mess without so much as a thank you? Do you think respect is telling me that all of that effort makes you feel like property? Because if that's what you think, then you don't know the first thing about respect." She flinched, her arms dropping to her sides for a moment, the fight drained out of her. But then she straightened her voice, quieter but no less firm. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for you to do everything. No, I said, stepping closer. But you expected it. Every time I stepped in to make things easier, you let me. Every time I picked up the slack, you leaned on it. And when I tried to talk about how it felt to carry all of that, you dismissed it as her eyes glossed over and she looked away, her hands clenching into fists. So what now? She asked, her voice breaking. Slightly, do we just keep tearing each other apart? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned back to the table, picking up my coffee cup and staring into it. I don't know, I admitted finally, but I do know I'm done being the only one carrying the weight. If this is what you wanted, true independence, then you've got it. But don't expect me to pick up the pieces. When things fell apart, she stood there for a long moment, as if waiting for me to take back my words. She gave a tremulous breath and left the room when I didn't. In contrast to the slamming doors of the previous few days, I heard the bedroom door close softly this time. My coffee grew cold in my hands as I lingered in the kitchen. The silence that descended upon the house after a storm seemed to be impossible. After that encounter, for the first time, I wasn't sure if we both wanted to try or if there was anything left to salvage. Days went by in a weird, tense limbo where we shared the same space but moved around each other like strangers. If anything, the distance between us seemed to widen. Every word felt measured, every interaction calculating. It was obvious that we had no idea how to close the distance, or even if we wanted to. When her friend Emily called, the first repercussions were felt. Emily usually calls her directly, but this time she contacted me. Hey, I've been trying to reach her, but she's not responding. She said cautiously. Is everything all right? I paused. I said, she's fine, just busy. Emily sounded doubtful. On Saturday, she didn't join us for lunch. That's not her. I deflected because I was at a loss for words. Perhaps you ought to question her about it. It didn't end there, even though it appeared to. My mom called a few days later. My wife had apparently confided in her in a frustrated moment. My mother spoke in a firm tone, just as she had when I was a teenager in trouble. What's happening with you two? She made a demand. You're not willing to assist with anything that doesn't sound like you, she said. I squeezed the bridge of my nose and sighed. It's not easy. Well, she snapped. Perhaps you should simplify it. It's about collaboration, not scorekeeping. Her remarks hurt, but I didn't argue because there was no use in explaining the subtleties to someone who wasn't residing in our home and wasn't affected by the year's worth of unspoken expectations and animosity. Although the strain began to seep into other aspects of our lives at work, the fallout wasn't just personal. I became sidetracked and started mentally reliving conversations, wondering where it had all gone wrong. She was overcoming her own obstacles. I heard her apologize to her boss over a Zoom call for missing a deadline, which wasn't typical of her. She was always the one who kept things organized and in control, but recently her professional manner was beginning to show signs of weakness. She was sitting on the couch with her laptop open and her face buried in her hands one evening when I got home. When she heard me enter, she looked up, her eyes red and tired. The Wi-Fi is not functioning, she stated bluntly. When I called the provider, they informed me that the account was past due. I hesitated for a second, unsure whether to intervene or let her deal with it. Finally, I said, you know how to pay it, right? She didn't respond. Instead, she closed the laptop and leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. Her words caught me off guard. What do you mean, this, she said, gesturing vaguely at the room. All of it. I feel like I'm drowning, and you're just standing there watching. I wanted to argue, to remind her that this was the independence she had asked for, but looking at her in that moment, I couldn't. She didn't look defiant or strong. She looked exhausted. And that's when it hit me. The consequences of our standoff weren't just affecting her. They were affecting both of us. The house was a mess, the bills were piling up, and we were both too stubborn to admit that this wasn't working. Whatever point I had been trying to make was starting to lose its meaning in the face of what we were actually losing. Each other. I sat down across from her, the silence between us heavy. For the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a stalemate, like we had both run out of moves. I didn't want it to get to this point, I said finally. She looked at me. Her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Sadness, maybe? Or regret? Neither did I. We sat there for a long time saying nothing, both of us trying to figure out what came next in the aftermath of everything we'd let fall apart. We didn't fix things that night. There was no magical reconciliation. No heartfelt apologies or promises to change. Instead, the days that followed were filled with an unspoken truce. It wasn't agreement. It was exhaustion. We had reached the limit of what either of us could endure. The first change came in small hesitant steps. The next morning I woke up to find her at the kitchen table with a stack of papers, bills, receipts, and account statements. She looked up as I entered the room, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Then she gestured toward the chair across from her. "Can we go through these together?" she asked quietly. It wasn't defiance, but it wasn't an apology either. After I took a seat, we began organizing the mess that we had both neglected for too long. For the first time in weeks of working together, I responded to her inquiries about payments and deadlines without passing judgment or using irony, not because one of us insisted, but because we both understood that it was necessary. The tone for the next few days was established by that small gesture of cooperation. She started being more self-reliant, making appointments, calling the utilities, and even preparing dinner without my help. In the meantime, I discovered that I was returning to roles of abandonment because I wanted to help, not because I felt obligated. Without being asked, I would take out the trash or wash the dishes she left in the sink. It was a beginning, but it wasn't a return to the previous state of affairs. It was a slow start to the conversation. She turned to face me while we were watching TV on the couch one evening. "Do you honestly believe that I don't value you?" she inquired. Startled by the unexpected question, I turned to face her. "I'll admit that there were moments when I thought you didn't, that everything I did was simply expected and unnoticed." With a thoughtful expression, she nodded. "That's not how I intended it to feel. I suppose I forgot what it must have been like for you because I became so accustomed to you taking care of everything, and I neglected to let you know when I needed assistance." I said that honesty was a turning point, but instead of speaking, I let it fester until it became resentment. We began to have more of those genuine conversations where we expressed our feelings without worrying about starting a new argument. Although there were still tense moments and it wasn't always simple, both parties put forth effort. As time went on, we started to rethink the nature of our relationship. It was now about sharing the load rather than one of us taking care of the other. She became reliant on me. I learned to back off without feeling like I was leaving her, without becoming reliant. Although things weren't flawless, they didn't have to be. Our home's chaos gradually subsided, but the wounds from those weeks persisted. They acted as a reminder of how nearly we had lost everything and how difficult it had been to regain equilibrium. We were having dinner one evening. She put her hand on mine after reaching across the table. "I don't want to lose this, but I don't want to go back to how things were," she said. I gave her hand a light squeeze and nodded. "I don't." We suddenly discovered our new normal as partners learning to deal with the messiness of life together, rather than as possessions or obligations.